Pues muy buenos días tengan todos ustedes a esta sesión de nuestra primera sesión del Seminario Internacional de Envejecimiento y Trabajo Social, la conferencia del doctor George W. Leeson, la sociedad centenaria, evidencias en Europa y en Inglaterra. Me da mucho gusto estar en este espacio y quiero darles la bienvenida a cada una de ustedes, a quienes nos sintonizan en YouTube y a quienes se encuentran en este canal. Darle la bienvenida también al doctor Martín Castro Guzmán, presidente de la Academia Nacional de Investigación en Trabajo Social, a la doctora Mireya Patricia Arias Soto, presidenta de la Red de Investigación en Trabajo Social y Envejecimiento, y bueno, a nuestro ponente magistral, al doctor John Leeson, profesor de la Universidad de Oxford, y a César González, que nos estará acompañando en la moderación de esta actividad. Entonces, vamos a dar un breve espacio para que el doctor Martín pueda darnos unas palabras de bienvenida y después continuaremos con el programa.
Bien, muchas gracias. Buenos días a todos los presentes, a quienes se encuentran en este espacio virtual por Zoom, también igual como aquellos que nos pueden visualizar por medio de YouTube, por el canal de ACANITS. Quiero agradecer también igual a los ponentes, en especial al doctor George Lexon, que nos acompaña el día de hoy, y también igual está con nosotros el doctor Carlos Miranda, y también lo que es el doctor César Alfredo González González, que también igual nos ha acompañado no solamente en esta red, sino en varias redes que tenemos como trabajadores sociales. También igual es importante agradecer a la Red Nacional de Investigación en Trabajo Social y Envejecimiento por hacer posible el desarrollo de este tipo de actividades académicas de carácter no solamente nacional, sino internacional, ¿no? Ello nos va a permitir fortalecer no solamente las líneas de generación y aplicación del conocimiento en el tema de envejecimiento y trabajo social, sino también fortalecer lo que son los programas académicos a nivel licenciatura y a nivel también igual de posgrado en trabajo social en las diversas instituciones de educación superior en México. Actualmente la Academia Nacional de Investigación en Trabajo Social, ACANITS, viene impulsando desde hace aproximadamente 7 años la organización de las redes temáticas de investigación. Este hecho nos ha permitido organizar un total de 7 redes académicas, cada una de ellas con su propia dinámica y su propia experiencia y sus propios temas, traducida en seminarios virtuales y presenciales que abonan a la problematización, reflexión y discusión colectiva en temas propios de cada red, pero que tiene que ver con el enriquecimiento teórico y metodológico de la disciplina de trabajo social y, por supuesto, de lo que es la profesión, lo que ha contribuido a la producción de las y los investigadores que participan en ello, pero que también igual ha contribuido al fortalecimiento de ACANITS. Y nos hemos beneficiado todos, ¿no? No solamente con lo que es el sello editorial, sino también igual con nuestra propia revista, que tiene el nombre de ACANITS, Redes Temáticas en Trabajo Social, y es un espacio para lo que son todas las redes. Yo creo que como parte de este seminario, lo que son las discusiones que se tengan por parte de los ponentes, yo creo que sí es un espacio para poder contribuir a lo que es la publicación a través de lo que es el sello ACANITS y sobre todo lo que es la revista. Pues bienvenidos todos, muchas gracias por la invitación y auguro un éxito total en este primer Seminario Internacional de Envejecimiento y Trabajo Social. Felicidades, colegas. Muchas gracias.
Josué, tomo yo la palabra.
Adelante, César, sí, por favor.
Okay. Buenos días. Good morning, everyone. Dr. Lison, I'm going to speak in Spanish for everyone else. It's going to take me just 1 minute, and then I'm going to read your academic profile, and after that, I will give you the microphone for the presentation. Buenos días a todas y todos. Soy César González. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la presentación de hoy sobre el primer Seminario Internacional de Envejecimiento y Trabajo Social. Estamos siendo testigos del cambio en las condiciones demográficas, sociales, culturales y económicas en todo el mundo, por lo que estamos muy emocionados de realizar un seminario centrado en los aportes e investigaciones sobre el envejecimiento desde el trabajo social. Voy a presentarles al profesor George Leeson, quien es profesor visitante de demografía en la Universidad de Guanajuato, León, en México. Es profesor asociado en el Instituto de Envejecimiento de la Población en la Universidad de Oxford, donde coordina la Red Latinoamericana de Investigación sobre el Envejecimiento, LARNA, y la Red de Investigación sobre el Envejecimiento de Europa Central y Oriental. Los principales intereses de investigación del doctor Leeson son los aspectos sociodemográficos del envejecimiento de las poblaciones, abarcando tanto el modelado demográfico del desarrollo de la población como el análisis de conjuntos de datos nacionales e internacionales. Dirigió el estudio longitudinal danés sobre el futuro, que aborda las actitudes y aspiraciones de las futuras generaciones de personas mayores en Dinamarca, y es investigador principal junto con la profesora Sarah Harper en el estudio global sobre el envejecimiento, una encuesta de 44,000 hombres y mujeres entre 40 y 80 años que se ha realizado en 24 países. Las investigaciones actuales del Dr. Leeson incluyen las desigualdades demográficas del envejecimiento global, las poblaciones cambiantes de Europa y América
¿Qué
Latina,
pasó?
la migración y los migrantes en Europa, las causas y las consecuencias de la despoblación o el despoblamiento en Europa Central y Oriental, y las perspectivas futuras de la longevidad. Para quienes nos siguen aquí en Zoom, voy a tratar de recoger las preguntas que ustedes tengan. Por favor, pónganlas en el chat. Si algunas de ellas son parecidas, entonces voy a tratar de entrelazarlas para traducirlas. Trataré de hacer la mejor traducción posible y transmitirlas al doctor George Leeson para que nos las dé. So, Dr. Leeson, from time to time, I will be translating the main ideas of your presentation because I'm not that advanced in the translation. I cannot do it right immediately. So if you allow me after some topics and you consider that is the right moment, please give me the word so I can translate for everybody else in Spanish and we can follow all your main ideas. Dr. Leeson, I turn it over to you for the presentation. The presentation is Who Wants to Live Forever? The Implications of Increasing Longevity. Please, Dr. George, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I understood a little bit. I'm sure it was very flattering, most of it. And thank you, most of all, for the invitation to speak this afternoon. And I'm sorry that we've had such difficulties with the technologies linking Mexico and the UK. Probably wasn't the technology, it was probably something to do with me not getting the right things into the computer, but here we are. So thank you for that. I'll try and, I know we're way behind time now, but I'll try and catch up. Let me share my screen. Is that okay?
No, we cannot see your screen.
You cannot see my screen. Oh dear.
No.
Why is that, I wonder?
Ah. You know how to do it?
I thought I had done it.
Okay.
I thought I had done it. Wait a minute, share.
Yeah,
now
that's right.
there we are, my PowerPoint. Yeah. So I just need to. There. Can you see
You are all
it?
set. Go ahead, please.
Okay, good. So yes, as Cesar Alfredo said, I am going to talk with a very general title about who wants to live forever. Many of you might recognize this as a line from a song by the rock band Queen. And I particularly want to look at the implications of the fact that we are all living longer. But I would like to begin by just alerting everyone to the fact that the data I'm going to be presenting are what we call at population level. And there are huge inequalities within countries and across countries that we need to bear in mind. So just keep that in mind when I'm talking. I don't know how much you want me to speak, says Alfredo, before you translate.
Maybe 3, 4 slides and I will catch all the ideas. If you wish, I can do this because it's important.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
So
Doctor Leeson nos dijo que lo que quiere preguntarse es quién quiere vivir para siempre, las implicaciones del incremento en la longevidad, pero quiere alertar, quiere poner el punto de que está hablando a un nivel poblacional, está hablando de esperanza de vida y entonces hay que estar al tanto de la desigualdad que hay en los países y al interior de los países.
okay, so let's ask ourselves again that question: who wants to live together? Well, forever. Sorry, who wants to live forever? There are already creatures, if you like, on this earth who have a lot of the components which we would need if we want to live forever, if that is something we wish to achieve. There is something called the Hydra vulgaris, and in fact, they don't age. They're tiny little creatures, and they don't age, which by biological definition actually means they are immortal. There is another little creature called the Hydra magnipapillata, where even after 1,400 years, we estimate that there is still 5% of the population of these tiny organisms which are still alive. And again, something that is contributing to our understanding of what enables such long lives in organisms and maybe then in people. Or something more at home, we may have even tasted these and eaten these in a restaurant. Clams, the Arctica islandica. You may have had this in something called clam chowder. I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is in Mexico, but we do eat these. The highest age that has ever been confirmed of these was 507 years, which means that when you eat your clam chowder, you could be eating a clam which was around at the time of very important historical events, certainly in England, during the time of Henry VIII. And those of you who are familiar with our history will know how important all of that was. So they're three little organisms, then two little organisms, and then the clam chowder, which is more of something that we can relate to, perhaps. Or maybe my daughter would like to live forever. My daughter Claudia, she's 25 years old, and her chance of death in the next 10 years is actually less than 1%. And it's like that until she reaches quite late middle age, early old age by our previous definitions.
Dr. Leeson, can you stop there? Because I have to...
Let me just do this one, Cesar. This one's linked.
Okay.
So, and then maybe you can pick it up. So if my daughter, so let's assume that out of that Hydra vulgaris creature, we could, the pharmaceutical industry could produce a pill that we could all take. And in terms of life expectancy for Claudia, that would translate into a life expectancy of around 8,000 years. A sobering thought, I think. Okay.
Ok. El doctor en las últimas 3 diapositivas nos presentó que hay organismos que no envejecen, que podríamos considerar que son inmortales. Algunos, como pudieron ver en la presentación, llegan a vivir 1,400 años, algunos otros 507. Y el estudiar a estos pequeños organismos nos permite entender por qué están viviendo tanto y en algún momento eso podríamos estarlo utilizando o lo estamos utilizando en realidad para tratar de alargar la esperanza de vida de la población de los humanos. Y en la diapositiva anterior se preguntaba cuál es la probabilidad de que su hija Claudia, que tiene 25 años de edad, tenga una esperanza alta, y mencionaba que ella tiene menos de 1% de probabilidad de fallecer en los siguientes 10 años. Es decir, hemos logrado disminuir la mortalidad en ciertos grupos poblacionales y eso hace que se incremente la esperanza. Y aquí nos dice que si Claudia pudiera tener las características de Hydra vulgaris, su esperanza de vida sería de alrededor de 8.000 años. Entonces piensen en ello. Dr. George, I finish this part.
Yep. So, okay. But they were quite almost science fiction scenarios, maybe, of the lengths of lives that could be possible, perhaps. But there is no doubt whatsoever that we are all living longer and longer. Some of us much longer lives than others. It does depend on our socio-economic situation, very much the circumstances in which we are born can impact on our life expectancy, and very much our own lifestyles, what we eat, what we drink, how much we exercise, etc. All of this we know impacts on our life expectancy. But despite all of the things that we do that could limit our life expectancy, medical science seems to be able to be one step ahead of us, and therefore enables us to live with these disadvantages, both physically and otherwise, and live long lives, but with disabilities perhaps. And it becomes a question of quantity of life versus quality of life, which is a very simple statement, but a very important one. So I'm going to present some data just from the UK. The global patterns are pretty much the same everywhere. But we are at different, if you like, populations and national populations are at different levels of this development. So not all populations around the world have life expectancies of maybe 90 or even more, as we see in Japan, Korea, elsewhere. But they do have much longer life expectancies than we saw for the previous generations in those countries. So in a way, we're all on the same trajectory. I've chosen 100 years as if you like, a benchmark for a long life, longer than we're perhaps used to most people living. If we think of our families and communities, we probably don't know very many who have reached 100 years. What I want to show in the rest of the presentation is that that is actually going to change. And that does have implications at various levels. So, according to the most recent, and this is actually this month, these data were released by the Office for National Statistics here in the UK. Only around 2.3% of females, according to the current life table, and therefore the current levels of mortality, age-specific levels of mortality, only 2.3% of them will survive to their 100th birthday, which doesn't sound like a lot. However, if we look at babies that are born today in the UK, it's estimated that maybe as many as a third of that generation born today, that cohort, will celebrate their 100th birthday. And actually, up to a fifth of those who are aged 65 today could also reach their 100th birthday. So suddenly we're looking at quite different sorts of numbers. The reason why we can say that around 2.3% of females will survive to their 100th birthday, and at the same time, a third of those being born today would survive to their 100th birthday. It's because we're looking at different scenarios of mortality, and we're also looking at a difference between what's called cross-sectional and generational mortality. Did you want to translate, says Alfredo, or do you want me to
Yes,
carry
thank
on?
you. Doctor Leeson nos está hablando ahora de que estamos viviendo más y más, pero una vez más quiere alertar sobre las diferencias que hay en los países y que tiene que ver con el estatus socioeconómico, con el estilo de vida, con hacer ejercicio, con la dieta. Y también mencionaba que sí, estamos aumentando la cantidad de años que la población está viviendo, pero también hay un cierto componente de discapacidad del cual deberíamos de estar al pendiente. Es decir, no es lo mismo cantidad que calidad de los años con que se vive. Después nos habla de que 2,3% de las mujeres actualmente llegarán, de habitantes del Reino Unido, van a sobrevivir hasta su cumpleaños 100. Eligió la edad 100 porque parece ahora para quienes estamos estudiando envejecimiento, que es una cifra que muy pocos alcanzan y que hasta hace algunos años no era algo plausible. Y después hace una comparación con las condiciones actuales de mortalidad, es decir, no es lo mismo tomar a alguien que nació hace 30 o 40 años bajo las condiciones de mortalidad que había, a un recién nacido ahora en 2025, y entonces por eso presenta estas estadísticas en donde dice que alrededor de una tercera parte de aquellos que están naciendo entre 2024 y 2025 van a celebrar su cumpleaños número 100 y que alrededor de entre el 15 y el 20%, es decir, uno de cada cinco de los que ahora tienen 65 años, se espera que lleguen a esas edades. Entonces, tener en cuenta esos escenarios diferentes para quienes somos demógrafos, eso es más o menos claro porque estamos hablando de condiciones de mortalidad y eso de alguna manera condiciona, no de alguna manera, condiciona la esperanza de vida y cómo se incrementa. I translate, Dr. Josh, is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. If we translate these figures into numbers, then we begin to see, perhaps in a more understandable way, the size of what we are experiencing and can expect to experience. So again, in the UK, according to latest figures from the United Nations, while there are around 15,000 people aged 100 or over in the UK today, in just 25 years, that will triple, and there will be 46,000, or at least expected. And by the end of this century, it will have increased tenfold or more, actually, to 170,000. Obviously, the more we predict into the future, the more uncertain the estimates become. But again, the trend is upwards, even though these figures have been adjusted in view of the COVID pandemic, which we don't really know how that's going to impact these extended long lives, but they have been adjusted. But the trend is still one of increase, increase, increase. So we have three types of mortality. Demographers talk of three types of mortality. Juvenile, that's everything to people under age 25. That is very low in most countries. There's a background mortality. In other words, it's difficult to say that there's an age pattern in this background mortality. It's very much to do with accidents, violence, can be some infectious diseases which suddenly impact. So, for example, COVID. And then there is what we call senescent mortality, the mortality that is there as we age. And we're moving from juvenile. So very few people like my daughter Claudia are experiencing, thank goodness, mortality under the age of 25. And we're moving more and more and more to, actually, mortality is something that we only see quite late in life. So we're moving into a society, if you like, all of us, where our experience of death is all at the end of life. Now, that's a sweeping generalization because of course people do die young, and that is tragic. But at the population level, it's very much becoming an old age experience. So how did we actually get here? How did we all become supermen and superwomen living these long lives? So what I've got here, I will try and explain it, and do forgive me if it's a little clumsy. What we have here are what are called survivorship curves, survival curves. And those of you who work in demography will be familiar with this. This is something that demographers use basically to put together all of the data they have on mortality for a population and put it into a very simple figure. And out of that, actually, we get the life table. And from that, we get a life expectancy. So rather than having lots and lots and lots of data, we sum it all up in a life expectancy. But here we've got these survival curves, which show the proportion. So on the y-axis here, we've got the survivors, and we're beginning with an artificial, because this is a constructed curve based on the observed mortality. We start with an artificial cohort of 1,000 people. And then on the x-axis, we follow them as they age all the way to 100. And we map their mortality. The curves are very different, as you will see. The lowest one down here, I'm trying to put my cursor on it, so I hope you can see it, is from the middle of the 16th century, 1541. Again, it wasn't like that in every country, but this is putting together the data that were available from that period. As we move upwards through the curves, the last one is from 1991. And basically what we're seeing, of course, is that the curve is being pushed up into this right-hand corner. And actually, it's still continuing. It's moving further and further over here. It's what demographers call the rectangularization of our survival. This is actually really quite amazing and sums up what has happened. If we go back to that early survival curve, we see that of the original 1,500, that is 50% of them, have actually managed to stay alive until only age 30. Okay, so 50% of that original cohort has died by the age of 30. Life expectancy, therefore, was around 30 back in that time. If we move forward to just 1991, then and follow the 500, the 50%, we can see that 50% actually survived to around 75, almost 80. And that again is that move from juvenile to senescent mortality. We can see that in the first 5 years of life, in the oldest survival curve, okay, we had already lost 35% of a generation after just 5 years. But looking at the more recent one on this graph, people are just not dying unless they are very unfortunate, being in an accident or getting a severe infectious disease or something similar to that. And it's not until late middle age and early old age that we begin to see any reduction in survival. I'll let you translate, Cesar, later.
Okay, thank you. And this will be easy for me because I am a demographer, so I understand everything that you say.
Oh, good.
And I use this graph. So let me translate, please. El doctor Leeson nos dice que el número de centenarios se incrementará o triplicará en 25 años al pasar de 15,000 a 46,000 y que esto se va a incrementar para 2100 hasta 170,000, pero pone especial énfasis en que es cuando las proyecciones son tan largas, es decir, si ahora estamos haciendo proyecciones a 70 años, puede ser que nos equivoquemos. De hecho, en demografía siempre se están modificando las esperanzas de las proyecciones de población porque hay cierta incertidumbre. Ponía como ejemplo el impacto de COVID, que que aumentó las muertes y entonces hay como algunos cambios, pero el patrón que hay de mortalidad y de sobrevivencia hacia el futuro pareciera que no va a cambiar, se incrementa, se incrementa y se incrementa. Además mencionaba los diferentes patrones de mortalidad, el juvenil, el de contexto que incluye los accidentes y la violencia, y el senescente, y cómo a través de los años hemos ido llevando las muertes a la senescencia, es decir, nos movemos a sociedades en donde la mortalidad se da a edades muy avanzadas. Y entonces preguntaba con la imagen de Superman, ¿cómo es que nos convertimos en superhombres y en supermujeres? Y entonces para ello utilizaba esta curva de sobrevivencia, estas curvas de sobrevivencia que están viendo en la pantalla, que lo que nos indica es todos los datos de mortalidad que se hacen en una gráfica. Hablaba también de una tabla de mortalidad de la cual se calculan las esperanzas de vida. Y lo que se ve aquí es cómo van sobreviviendo y cómo está construida. Esta es una cohorte ficticia que tiene 1000 individuos y entonces mencionaba que la curva que está hasta abajo, que es de 1541, a edad 5 de esos 1000 que nacieron, a edad 5 ya habían fallecido más del 30% de la población y que eso tenía un impacto directo en la esperanza de vida, pues era de alrededor de 30 años y después lo comparaba con la línea de hasta arriba, que es de 1991, y cómo a edad 60 todavía sobrevivía el 50% de la población. Es decir, hay un patrón cambiante en la mortalidad que permite que se vaya incrementando la esperanza de vida y que los demógrafos utilizan herramientas como esta para explicar cómo ha sido ese cambio. Thank you, Dr. George.
Okay, thank you. So when we look at this figure, it's not surprising that the key question that we ask ourselves is not just how far up into this top right-hand corner the survival curve will move, but actually how far along the axis here we can move beyond 100. In other words, can we extend human life beyond what we have seen thus far? And the most verifiable long life has been about 122. Some may claim longer lives, but the documentation, the paperwork is really not reliable. So, but 122 seems to be acceptable. So that's the big question as we move forward. How far up into the corner and how much can we extend the x-axis beyond 100 years? Well, we can see how fast this development has taken place. And what we're looking at here is the mortality rate between age 65, 74 in England and Wales, and how long it actually took to achieve a 20% decrease in the level of mortality. We're going back to the beginning of the 20th century. The first 20% decrease in mortality for these males aged 65 to 74, so early old age, actually took 68 years. Remember, we're moving into that senescent mortality. The next one, 20% decline, only took 17 years, so it's gathering pace. And the next one, just 10 years. And then just 6 years. And if we then move it forward beyond 2002, more recently, it's 6 years and 6 years. So in a sense, we've sort of reached a point where it's becoming more difficult, and that's understandable. It's becoming more difficult to achieve these declines in mortality, but they are still happening, and they are actually still happening relatively quickly. This is an interesting graph. And it's interesting because whenever I think, and Cesar Alfredo explains that he's a demographer too, and I'm sure he has the same experience, that whenever we talk about extending life expectancy, there are always the voices of caution saying, no, 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 there is a limit. There's a limit to what we can achieve. And I think we've reached that limit, and therefore we're now plateauing. That has happened many times, and I'll just give a couple of examples. But first of all, I wanted to show this graph. And this shows the y-axis is the population life expectancy, and it's from 1840 right up to the beginning of the 21st century. This is not for a single population. The life expectancies which are shown in this graph, that's the life expectancy of the longest lived population at the time. Okay, so sometimes it'll be the early years where the data were relatively reliable and available. That will be European populations. As we move closer to the 20th century and the end of the 20th century, we're talking about maybe Japan and Asian populations. What we see is wonderful, almost for a mathematician, improbable lines. There's perfect correlation here. And basically, for 160 years, the trend was upwards, and it was actually 3 months a year was being added on to the longest lived population. Okay, so 2.5 years every decade, 10 years every 40 years. And historically, when we look at that, that's about right. When we look at our own populations, give or take a few years. So an extraordinary piece of evidence that actually it is just continuing and continuing. But again, even with this, there will be, understandably, I think, those who say, yes, but we cannot go on. The medical advances will not continue, and there will be a limit. So if we look at this graph, I've just taken some European countries here, men and women. This is life expectancy. Life expectancy at birth from the middle of the 20th century to around the middle of the 21st century. These are data from the United Nations. And again, we can just see, we don't have to worry about which country is which, but the trend is upwards, both for men and for women. And the data always also show us that men's life expectancy is lower than women's at every age. Interestingly, the gap widened. If we took this further back, the gap was only a couple of years, but it widened, and it does now seem to be converging. And again, the latest data from the UK would suggest that men are both catching up with women, and that women are beginning to slow down in the increase in their life expectancy. That's life expectancy at birth. And we can see, again, for England and Wales at least, I've plotted in here how this actually developed in more detail, going back to the middle of the 19th century. The reason why I've got this one here is not to just show you again the same sort of trend, because that's what it is doing. But I want to show you how a sudden impact on life expectancies, as they are measured in a life table, a period life table, how they can have an impact, but how that impacts eventually disappears. We've experienced this in the past. And I'm showing it because, of course, during the coronavirus, the COVID pandemic, life expectancies in the period life tables did decrease. And there was a lot of debate about whether or not that meant we would not see increases in life expectancy as we had been predicting. Well, here we have the graph for England and Wales, and we can see here for men a huge, significant decline in life expectancy. Okay, from just over 50, actually, to the level that we saw back in the middle of the 16th century. Slightly less for women, but even so. The drivers here for the First World War, but more importantly, perhaps the Spanish influenza, because that affected the women as well. So an epidemic that really impacted on all age groups and caused the life expectancy to plummet, particularly for men. But see how quickly it returned to its previous level and continued its upward trend. So any losses were quickly redeemed and we continued on the trend. The smaller drop here is around the Second World War and the situation of people in the Second World War, not just the soldiers, but citizens as well. And again, a drop, not as much as the Spanish flu in the First World War, but a drop, but again, coming back. And then we've got the period that I've just shown you in the previous graph where we see men and women converging here. So historically, we can say that our populations are very resilient to such events that impact on our life expectancy as they are measured here. And therefore, perhaps the COVID pandemic was a similar sort of event, and we're now back on our upward trajectory. Because, of course, after COVID, although it does sound very morbid, after COVID, we're left with the survivors. We are left with stronger generations, if you like. I mean, this rather simple phrase, the survival of the fittest, is clearly at work. Did you want to translate, César?
Yes, thank you. El doctor Leeson al final de la gráfica anterior, en la de curvas de sobrevivencia, la pregunta importante era ¿cuánto podemos movernos más allá de los 100 años? Y pone la pregunta de que hace 40 o 50 o 100 años no pensábamos que era posible que hubiera una esperanza de vida tan alta y ahora seguimos pensando quizás que no podemos llegar a 150, a 200 años y entonces ¿qué tanto podemos alargar la vida? Lo que sí es que muestra evidencia de que hemos ido incrementando esta esperanza de vida al reducir la mortalidad en el grupo de 65 a 74 años. Decía que para disminuir un 20%, la primera vez había tomado 68 años, después 17 para reducir otro 20%, después 10, después 6 y después 6. Es decir, que lo estábamos haciendo cada vez más rápido el incrementar esa esperanza de vida y en parte tiene que ver con lo que nos ha venido explicando los avances médicos, la disminución de la mortalidad en etapas juveniles, pero también nos dice que es más difícil lograr la disminución de la mortalidad. Y en la gráfica mencionaba que siempre algunos estudiosos de las esperanzas de vida, que siempre hay un límite y que después de que se alcanza, se volverá constante. Y mostraba también la esperanza de vida de la población de una que tiene la esperanza de vida más alta, la que era la gráfica previa a esta. Y lo que veía, él mencionaba como maravilloso, es que se ganan 3 meses de esperanza de vida al año, lo cual es muy alto y es una evidencia extraordinaria porque son datos que se tienen. Después presentaba la esperanza de vida de países europeos y mencionaba la tendencia que siempre va hacia arriba y las diferencias entre hombres y mujeres. Sin embargo, como lo hemos visto también en otras poblaciones, la brecha entre esperanzas de vida entre países también se ha ido disminuyendo y eso es algo bueno e interesante. Y en esta gráfica muestra los efectos de la Primera Guerra Mundial y de la influencia española sobre la mortalidad. Son los picos que él mencionaba aquí. Pegó más en hombres que en mujeres y después la Segunda Guerra Mundial y también el efecto que tiene en la esperanza de vida. pero al mismo tiempo mencionaba que siempre regresa a los niveles previos y que siempre va hacia arriba. Y entonces hablaba de COVID, aquí no tiene porque está hasta 2011, pero cuando hablaba de COVID, él tiene la esperanza de que tendremos poblaciones más resilientes, perdón, que serán más fuertes y que entonces vamos a analizar qué pasa después de COVID, pero él cree que rápidamente se recuperará esta esperanza de vida y que seguirá con una tendencia hacia la alta. That's it, Dr. George.
Yep, thank you, Cesar. Although the life expectancy at birth is interesting, increasingly we do look at life expectancies in later life. So it's the same sort of idea, but we're now looking at people who have survived to the age of 65 in England and Wales. What is their remaining life expectancy, according to current, as we depicted on the x-axis, the different periods, according to the mortality at the time? And we can see how that actually has also been on an upward trend since the turn of the 20th century. So if we look around here, the first 60 years or so, not a lot is happening. It's hovering around 10, 11, 12. But then it begins to take off and women begin to leave men behind. This is what I was pointing out earlier. So we have a difference actually in life expectancy of probably around 4 years between men and women at age 65. But it's now beginning to narrow. So this graph is interesting because it's actually gotten rid of a lot of that, if not all of that pre-senescent mortality. So now we've arrived in early old age and we're looking forward to the life expectancies from age 65 onwards. And again, it's a very positive sort of picture that we get. But I don't know, can you see the top of my screen? Can you see the title of the slide? Are you able to see the title of the slide? Yeah, because I can't see it on my screen.
Yes, and our youth is disappearing.
Yeah, I know what it is. I just wondered whether you could see it. Yeah. So when we look at population dynamics, as it's called, the one side of it is mortality. The other side of it is fertility. And then we've also got migration, of course. These three components together determine the structure of our populations. Fascinating as the declines in mortality and increases in life expectancy, fascinating though they are, what we've seen at the same time, and particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, and it continues today, we've stopped having children. Again, this is at the population level, but we've stopped having children. And this is a graph from the middle of the 20th century until the middle of the 21st century. And if we look where we are today, there are none of these European countries which have what we call total fertility rates significantly above the level of 2. And 2.1 is roughly the figure that we're looking for, because 2.1 at the population level means that that population can reproduce itself. Certainly in a lot of the press and governments around the world currently, this is causing in many ways more concern for them than the aging in terms of numbers of older people. Because of course the younger generations are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is a worry for politicians. Doesn't have to be, but they seem very worried about it. As I say, this all impacts on our population distribution. This is a typical, what demographers call an age pyramid. As you can see, this pyramid is beginning to crumble, but it had the makings of the pyramid up here. And then we begin to see different developments in both mortality and fertility along the way. So this is actually what the UK population distribution looks like at the moment. And it reflects the history, the demographic history in more recent years. So we have a peak here both for men and women. That's actually the baby boom just after the, excuse me, just after the Second World War. These are what are known as the baby boomers. And then we have another peak here. These are the children of the baby boomers. Another one here, in a way, the children of the baby boomers. And then down here, we can see another one beginning. In more recent years, the lower age groups here are also the result of very large levels, very high levels of immigration. That's what it looks like at the moment, but we're moving towards this. Our pyramid is becoming a skyscraper. And we will, with the very low levels of childbearing and the very low levels of mortality, which don't change much until extreme old age, we will see that every bar of that pyramid is now pretty much the same size, men and women, all the way up, until we begin to get late senescent mortality coming in and giving us the peak on the skyscraper. Did you want to translate that last little bit, Cesar?
Okay, let me see if I have everything. Lo que nos mostraba es que hasta 1900 no había muchos cambios en la esperanza de vida a edad 65, pero que a partir de 1910 en las mujeres se empieza a ver un incremento más sostenido y mucho más amplio que el de los hombres, y que además hay tres elementos claves para el crecimiento de una población: los nacimientos, la mortalidad y la migración. En otra de las gráficas nos mencionaba, en la que nos preguntaba si se veía el título, nos mostraba las tasas de fecundidad y cómo han ido disminuyendo. Mencionaba que hay un 2.1 hijos en promedio por mujer para asegurar una tasa de reemplazo, es decir, si está por debajo de eso, entonces las poblaciones tenderán a ir disminuyendo en su número, y eso es una complicación y eso tiene un efecto directo también en el envejecimiento. Y después mostraba la pirámide de Reino Unido, y explicaba los picos en la pirámide, cómo estaban los baby boomers, es decir, aquellos que nacieron en Segunda Guerra Mundial, y después el otro pico, los hijos de los baby boomers, y cómo se ve ese crecimiento. Y mostraba una pirámide al final de esta sección, en donde prácticamente la mortalidad ahora está en la edad senescente, las tasas de fecundidad son muy bajas y entonces pareciera que tenemos una población estable y que casi todos los que nacen llegan hasta las edades avanzadas, y por eso en lugar de tener una pirámide ahora tenemos una gráfica completamente diferente. Y eso pareciera que va a cambiar por los bajos niveles de fecundidad y mortalidad. Y eso es todo. That's it, Dr. George. It's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, there has always been a little, shall we say, doubt about future predictions, particularly about mortality, but also about levels of childbearing. But if we look at mortality and we ask ourselves the question, when we make these predictions and statements, do we actually get it right? So about 40 years ago, if you look at population forecasts in much of Europe, certainly, one of the assumptions of those forecasts would be that the mortality of people over the age of 60 was constant. That is why all of those forecasts got it wrong. Because as I've tried to illustrate in some of the graphs I've shown you, it's particularly that group that have experienced quite dramatic decreases in mortality. And no one was looking for that. No one was looking for that. And I remember some years ago working with the Danish government, and there was almost a disbelief, you know, sort of where had all these older people come from? Well, they hadn't died on time. They were surviving beyond what all the predictions had been saying. So if we look a little at some of the statements, back in the 1920s, the limit for life expectancy was predicted to be just less than 65 years. But actually, even when Dublin made this statement based on his own calculations, that had already been exceeded in New Zealand. Much later, 1990, J. Olshansky suggested that there was a limit of 35 years at age 50 in terms of life expectancy. But again, just 6 years later, Japanese females had actually proved him wrong. So we have to be wary of putting that limit, but we do also have to be equally wary of going into the realms of science fiction and saying, life expectancies of 1,000 years are possible. That really is stretching the limits of our imagination. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I think we're okay. So future prospects, let's just look at the future. Again, some statements here. Back in the 1990s, many were saying, and I've just brought one statement here, the possibilities of lengthening life appear practically unlimited. So we've gone from saying there is a limit to our lives in terms of years lived to saying, actually, there doesn't seem to be a limit, or at least the possibility of a limit is receding. And adding to that, we look to human technologies. Technologies that will extend our lives and make our lifespans much longer. And it's the technologies that will limit the length of our lives. What sort of technologies will we be able to develop? Technologies which help us support when our muscles are getting weaker. These already exist. Clothes you can wear that support muscles. And then an interesting one at the beginning of the 21st century. And the cure for aging is no longer science fiction. That's an interesting quote because of the use of the word cure. So Aubrey de Grey at that time was actually putting aging in the same category as illnesses and diseases for which we try to find cures. And suddenly he's opening up for life extension thanks to medical interventions, and that we will be able to cure aging. And there is a huge amount of research, not necessarily looking for a cure for aging, but cures for some of the diseases of aging, which would then extend our lives at the population level even more. And some of the work that I was doing, about 10 years ago, I started on this and was looking at the centenarians and the sudden increase in numbers of centenarians that had happened and that was expected to happen. And I just happened to say that the 21st century will be the century of centenarians. And I think the data I presented a little earlier would still support that suggestion that we are in the century of centenarians. And here are some figures to look at that. So at the moment, globally, there are 630,000 centenarians spread across the whole world. That's expected to reach almost 18 million by the end of the century. So a very sizable number of centenarians. And just note the increase in this number of centenarians in the more developed countries of the world. This is as defined by the UN, and the less developed countries of the world. So the less developed countries of the world at the moment, 220,000 centenarians, expected to increase to over 14 million. These are countries which have very limited resources to sustain their populations as they are at the moment. And so if we do see such a dramatic increase, they will be challenges of a sort not seen before. Or many demographers will say, well, it's not achievable because they will be caught in what's called a Malthusian trap, that they will simply not be able to sustain this number of people, and we will see massive, massive deaths from increasing mortality, lack of food, lack of water, conflict, etc., etc. To check that population growth, because there are not the resources to support those large numbers of extremely old people. The UK, the top line, we have the figures that I presented earlier, going from 15,000 to just short of 200,000. When I started looking at centenarians, I produced some alternative forecasts looking at not just what we had been experiencing, but what could be achieved given something that was being experimented with mice and rodents, and the life expectancy increases that were being witnessed there. And if that were translatable, a bit like the pill for my daughter Claudia, the Hydra vulgaris pill, then the 15,000 would become almost 2 million in the UK. A huge shift and a huge challenge, not just for society, but for individuals and families and communities. Did you want to translate, Cesar? Or are you okay?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Ok, el doctor Leeson se pregunta, dice que siempre hay incertidumbre sobre las predicciones y se pregunta si las hemos estado haciendo bien. Y parte de esa pregunta es como retórica porque en realidad los supuestos de mortalidad están cambiando, la sociedad ha estado cambiando y uno de los supuestos que hay es que la mortalidad después de 60 años es constante y eso no ha sido cierto. Y trató de mostrárnoslo tanto en las gráficas como en las diapositivas, como justamente después de 60 o 65 años la mortalidad ha ido cambiando a lo largo del tiempo. En 1928 se pensaba que la esperanza de vida máxima que se podría alcanzar era de 64,75 años. En el 1990, Jay Olshansky dijo que a edad 50 la esperanza de vida era de otros 35 años, es decir, alguien que tenía 50 años podía esperar vivir otros 35. Sin embargo, menciona que en ambos casos esa esperanza de vida se sobrepasó muy rápido y entonces la pregunta es, ¿cuál es el límite? Y entonces mencionaba algunas frases sobre el futuro, decía que no hay límites para la esperanza de vida que podemos alcanzar, que el límite es la tecnología, lo hemos ido viendo con el transcurso de los años, cómo los avances tecnológicos han permitido que reduzcamos la mortalidad. Hablaba de la cura del envejecimiento, que no es parte más de la ciencia ficción, y aquí hacía énfasis en la palabra cura porque algunos estudiosos la han utilizado como el envejecimiento, como si fuera una enfermedad o una discapacidad, y eso no necesariamente es cierto. Y decía que el siglo XXI será el siglo de los centenarios y para ello utilizó un par de tablas en donde muestra las cifras y cómo, si las vieron que estaban 15, 270, esas en realidad habría que multiplicarlas por 1000, que era una nota que tenía ahí arriba, y hablaba en algunos casos de millones. Hablaba también, porque hacía la diferencia entre países más desarrollados y países menos desarrollados, que en los segundos habrá un reto mayor, pues hay una escasez de recursos y que eso implicaría como una visión maltusiana de que no vamos a tener los suficientes elementos como para hacer que esta población sobreviva y que entonces podríamos estar experimentando en el futuro una mortalidad alta, pues no tendríamos esos recursos para atender a la población. Y terminó con cuando empezaba a analizar los centenarios y decir que no solamente son los retos para la sociedad, sino para los individuos, para la familia y para las instituciones. Go ahead, please, Dr. George.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So just to translate that into some other figures, again, maybe more easy to understand. These are data from one of our government departments, and were suggesting that around 14% of the current population at the time would live to be 100 years old. Now, they wouldn't all live to be 100 years old at the same time, of course, but it's quite a sizable proportion of the population who could expect to live that long compared with what we perhaps are seeing now. 3 million would be currently under the age of 16, 5.5 million currently aged 16 to 50, and 1.3 million aged 51 to 65, and almost 1 million are already aged over 65. So their achievement of becoming 100 is much more closer than, for example, those under the age of 16, of course. So again, the numbers are quite sobering, as we would say in English. They do demand to be taken seriously and to be addressed. It's not something that will go away. So what sort of a world is it that we're entering? I can't resist, of course, a quote by Shakespeare, our greatest dramatist in the UK, from a play called The Tempest, and he says, "Oh, brave new world that hath such people in it." These people being the ones who are going to be living such long, long lives. I'm sure everybody is aware with the WHO's age-friendly initiatives. And according to them, this age-friendly world will enable people of all ages to participate in community activities, treated with respect regardless of their age. Makes it easy for older people to stay connected. And it helps people stay healthy and active, even in extreme old age. But also providing the appropriate support to those no longer unable to look after themselves and live independently. These are key statements. These are key targets in a world which is aging so dramatically. And we're all experiencing it. We all have different resources to be able to meet these challenges and turn them into opportunities. And again, I'm sure many of you are aware of the focus of a lot of the technological and pharmaceutical industries on aging and producing both technologies and pharma that enable us to age healthily and have long lives. So is it about industry meeting these challenges, or is it about us? Or in actual fact, it's probably about all of that, and we're all involved in this. But just some questions to finish with, and then we can move on to a discussion if there is time for that. So what will these brave new worlds, what will these societies look like? I think it's fair to say, given our radically extended lives, and these are lives which will be very healthy for many people, not all, but for many people, and they will remain healthy for much longer than we've seen in the past for our parents and our grandparents' generations. So, and again, there is a lot of debate, a lot of discussion. How do we achieve this? The fact that we need to rethink our life courses, our education. Is it really possible to complete an education at the age of 21, 22, and then be prepared for a life of another 90 years, maybe? And what about work? Are we still going to insist on people leaving the workplace at age 65 or 69 or 70? Given the fact that many of these people who are being forcibly removed from the workplace because of their age are very capable of continuing in one way or another. But also given the fact that, as we've shown, there are fewer and fewer younger people coming into our populations. So we need healthy older people to replace in the workplace, for example, those young people who are just not being born. So we need a broad understanding and of what these life courses of 100 years will be like. And contributing to that are those technologies, as I say, both medical technologies and information technologies. All of this means something for our homes. It means something for us as individuals. It means something for us staying in our homes, in our communities, the balance between work and leisure, and also the balance between health and ill health. So there's a long list of challenges, none of which are insurmountable, but all of which need looking at. We can't just look at one, because this demography that I've been trying to explain impacts on all of them. And let me conclude by going back to the future. We started with the Hydra vulgaris and the chowder clam, and my daughter, Claudia. Well, there's another little creature called the planarian flatworm, which you've probably never heard of. Or maybe there is someone in the audience who has heard of this little creature. These planarian flatworms, they are masters of regeneration. Cut off a tiny piece of their body and they regenerate into a complete organism. Their ability to be able to do this relies on what's called pluripotent stem cells. So they can regenerate healthy bodies from just a little bit of the body. And they have shown studies involving these planarian flatworms that if you cut up a planarian, you can actually generate several hundred tiny animals. And this is nothing new. Back in the 1800s, they were called immortal under the edge of a knife because they just reproduced themselves. What is important for us moving forward, perhaps, is that the blueprint and the construction material for this regeneration process has to be in every little fragment that we cut off. A small piece of the tail becomes the complete worm, and it does it itself. No interventions from outside. And maybe pluripotency, as witnessed in the planarian flatworms, is the key to stem cell therapy, and that being then the key to extending human lives. So pluripotency is the ability of one cell to produce any given cell found in an organism. Could be the muscle, the nerve, the pancreatic cells, but they only arise in the early embryonic stage for healthy mammals. And stable pluripotency in the adult organism is something special but not impossible as long as mechanisms exist. To be able to conserve this characteristic of regeneration, there are a lot of ethical issues, and I'm sure you're aware of those debates that have been going on around those ethical issues. But the science seems to be moving in that direction, whether or not societies will take on board that science, and we as individuals are comfortable with that science, is perhaps another question. So think of this brave new world that we're moving into as a box of what we call marbles, these little glass colored balls. And they're in a tin. And that's what it looks like at the moment. And we're in the process of taking that tin of marbles and throwing all the marbles up into the air. And they'll come down in a very different pattern. That's our brave new world of the future. And that leaves me only to say thank you to all for listening, but more importantly, huge thanks to Cesar Alfredo Gonzalez for what I'm sure has been an unbelievably perfect translation. I can only thank you, Cesar Alfredo, for providing that and hopefully enabling some of the messages, at least, that I was trying to convey to get over to everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'll try my best, and I don't know if I translate everything like you said, but I try to put all the main ideas. So let me take the last 5 or 6 slides to translate for all of the audience. Okay, se espera que 14% de la población actual vivirá hasta los 100 años y muestra la cantidad de personas que hay en cada uno de los grupos, como lo vieron. Menciona qué haremos y tiene ahí a la WHO, que es la Organización Mundial para la Salud. Habla de un mundo amistoso con la edad, es decir, tratar a todos con respeto sin importar la edad. Al final de cuentas estamos cambiando todas las poblaciones y estamos teniendo población en edades avanzadas que habría que considerarlas y tratarlas con respeto. Y después planteaba las preguntas, ¿es sobre la industria? Somos nosotros y eso me remite a las primeras diapositivas en donde hablaba sobre estilos de vida, pero incluso sobre las características de cada uno de los países, o es sobre todos los involucrados, es decir, todos los que estamos actuando como sociedad para tener estos grupos de edad. Y entonces preguntan cómo se verán las sociedades, qué significa una sociedad amistosa con la edad. Habría que entender a los centenarios, habría que prepararse para vidas largas y eso nos atañe a todos los que estamos aquí, todos los que nos van a escuchar y a ver en YouTube. Hablaba de las tecnologías, de los cambios en los hogares, temas que desde trabajo social y desde diferentes disciplinas hemos estado abordando, las comunidades, hablaba del empleo y también la edad al retiro, si deberíamos mantener los 65 años, y además la salud y enfermedad, solo por mencionar algunos de los temas que se ven impactados y afectados por la demografía, que es algo que trato de incluir en esto, porque al final del día los cambios que hay tanto en mortalidad como en nacimientos como en migración están afectando las formas en cómo tenemos las sociedades y en cómo nos organizamos. Puso el ejemplo de un gusano, el Planarians, que son los maestros de la regeneración, y hablaba de las células STEM y lo pluripotente. Ahí sí no soy tan especialista en eso, no entiendo bien qué significa, pero después lo buscamos. Lo que sí dice es que tiene capacidad de convertirse en cientos de animales y además de autorregenerarse. Y decía, ¿y eso qué tiene que ver con nosotros? ¿Por qué lo traigo a colación? Porque dice que puede ser la clave para extender las vidas humanas, que podemos explorar esas características, que hacia allá va la tecnología. Lo que sí es que necesitamos tener en cuenta las cuestiones éticas, porque ahora se estaría manipulando también vidas humanas. Lo que sí es innegable es que nos estamos moviendo en esa dirección, que es un mundo nuevo, y al final terminaba con la caja de canicas en donde decía que si las avientas hacia arriba, cualquier patrón puede emerger y cualquier cosa puede ser posible.
César, silenciaste tu micrófono.
Okay, I know that in the chat are several questions. Some of them are in English and some of them are in Spanish. Dr. George, if you read some of them, maybe you can give me 2 or 3 minutes to read those who are in Spanish, and you can tackle the ones in English, and then I will come back and do the questions in Spanish for you. You are on mute.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the English ones now. I've found a couple. Yeah, so okay, so let me go back to the first one. I'll take them one by one, if that's okay. So there is a first one saying, thank you for sharing your knowledge. What do you think will be the impacts on access to healthcare as a result of increased life expectancy in emerging countries? And this is from Carla Carrasco. And apologies for the pronunciation if I got that completely wrong. But well, yeah, as I mentioned right at the beginning of my talk, we have huge inequalities, both within countries and between countries. And I think, Carla, if I may, I think you highlight one of the big issues that I also tried to highlight in terms of the increase in number of centenarians in emerging developing countries. That the resources here are very limited. And even now, as we speak, older people compete for those resources with younger people. And it is only in recent years, so I think, for example, of the African continent, and it's only in recent years that the African continent has begun to acknowledge, and maybe the same is true in Latin America to some extent, has begun to acknowledge the aging of the population. But there's a long way to go before they're going to be in a position. So access to healthcare, probably not going to change a lot, because most people in these emerging economies have very limited access to healthcare. And the healthcare that is available is also very limited. So not too sure about that at all, that there's a very optimistic story in there. I may be wrong. I hope that I am wrong. But given the current way of thinking, I think it would be difficult to see moving forward. But as I say, things are happening, but slowly. I don't know whether, Cesar, are you going to translate my answer, or is Carla okay with that answer?
I guess Dr. Carla Carrasco, it's okay with the English. So
Okay, good. So let me take the next one. It says, how will it affect global aging? No, sorry, how will population, this is from Diego Garcia Martinez. Thank you, Diego, for this. Asking, how will population aging affect global economies, especially in terms of productivity and economic growth? And how can the need to extend working lives be balanced with the quality of life and health of older workers? Two really important questions, actually. And there seems to be a general feeling that population aging is bad. I think, generally speaking, governments, societies think population aging is bad. And yet, we all want to live as long as possible. So how do we bring those two together? So, when we talk about population aging, what you have to remember, Diego, is that these long lives are being achieved because we are healthier. So we are not, currently at least, we are not, when we extend life by 5 years, extending disability, dependency, etc., by 5 years. Healthy life expectancy may not be keeping up 100% with life expectancy, but there's a lot of positive evidence that older people today, and particularly around that traditional retirement age, older people can still contribute. And as I say, it's going to be vitally important that we encourage and enable those older people who want to and who can contribute, that we encourage and enable them to contribute. Because there aren't any young people coming through. You know, when you talk to politicians about this, it doesn't matter where I go in the world and talk to politicians, they'll say, but they are going to then take jobs from young people. Those young people don't exist, not to the extent that these politicians and others think they exist. They're not being born. So we do need to have we need to rethink the way we look at work and who is working. Professor Harper at the Institute of Population Aging in Oxford here, and we worked on something called the Global Aging Survey with in different waves, 40,000, 50,000, 70,000 people around the globe looking at their expectations for later life. And in almost every country, people coming up to and just beyond retirement age were saying, we want to continue to contribute. Why are we not allowed to continue to contribute? So for them, and all the research shows, despite everything we might think when we're younger, all of the research shows that actually working is good for us for all sorts of reasons, not just financially, but it's also mentally and physically good for us. We get networks, we meet people, we engage with people. And from one day to the next on retirement, disappears. And it can be very difficult to recreate those networks that we automatically have in the workplace. And again, I think we're beginning to see with younger generations how, I don't know in Mexico, but certainly here in Europe, working from home is now the expected norm for younger generations. But those same generations are beginning to say, I've got problems, I never meet anybody, I don't have that social engagement, I've got mental health problems, etc., etc. So working is good for us. So it would be good for us as individuals, but also for societies, if we can match up the demography with the needs of both younger and older people. I hope that answers Diego's question. Sorry if I'm taking a long time.
No, you also answer a lot of questions that are made in Spanish. So
okay. Good.
It's very interesting. For me, this presentation is like music to my ears. I am a demographer, an economist, and I like everything you present. And when I see your country, Mexico is not different. Maybe we are 20, 25 years ahead, but no, not ahead.
Behind.
Yeah, but we are experiencing the same issues, the same things, and we can learn from the international experiences, and that's why we are having this conversation with you, and we appreciate your time and your knowledge, and we hope that we can see us in some congress or seminar or somewhere else, because it's a lot of information. It's how we are living the aging process from the population standpoint of view. So here at the social work and gerontologists, I guess, community, it's always interesting to see a different perspective and how this have an impact in all the dimensions of life, and we should think about it. So let me go to Spanish to say goodbye to everybody, because we are on time. It's 11:52, so we are beyond the time that we are projecting. So thank you very much, Dr. George.
A pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. And let's do stay in touch. I'm very
Okay,
happy.
I will look for your email and I will send one.
Right. Okay.
Okay, gracias a
Thank you,
todas y a,
Manuel.
gracias a todas y a todas por estar con nosotros. Esta fue la primera sesión muy importante, muy interesante. Creo que fija el rumbo de lo que se quiere transmitir con esta red de envejecimiento y de trabajo social. Como ven, no solamente es trabajo social, tenemos además, si miran entre todas las que estamos participando en esta reunión de Zoom, podrán ver que tenemos diferentes perfiles, que tenemos a personas que de manera inter, multi y transdisciplinaria están abordando el envejecimiento. Agradezco al doctor Josué Méndez Cano que me haya invitado a moderar. Espero haberlo hecho lo suficientemente bien. Si no, todo lo que haya yo dicho es nada más mi culpa. Entonces, muchas gracias y le dejo la palabra al doctor Josué para que cierre la sesión.
Muchísimas gracias, César. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Lison. Eh, la verdad es que es un honor haber tenido esta primera sesión. Y bueno, a nombre de la red, a nombre de la academia, sí me voy a permitir compartirles la constancia del doctor Leeson, que a la letra dice: la Red Nacional de Investigación en Trabajo Social y Envejecimiento, en coordinación con la Academia Nacional de Investigación en Trabajo Social, pues otorgan la presente constancia a George W. Leeson por dictar la conferencia La Sociedad Centenaria, Evidencias en Europa y en Inglaterra, el 20 de febrero de 2025, en el marco del primer Seminario Internacional de Envejecimiento y Trabajo Social, aportes e investigaciones sobre el envejecimiento. Muchísimas gracias, doctor Lison. Y también, César, muchísimas gracias por todo el apoyo, por la traducción. Y en tu caso, César, pues agradecemos y te haremos llegar también una constancia como moderador de esta conferencia. Les invitamos, el día 20 de marzo tenemos la siguiente actividad académica, la siguiente conferencia. En esa sesión nos acompañará un colega, bueno, conocido por algunos de ellos, es el doctor Laureano Reyes, de la Universidad de Chiapas. Les voy a compartir también el flyer para que no se nos olviden. Les pido también que quienes nos están acompañando a través del Zoom, les hemos enviado una liga para que hagan su registro oportuno. Dado que tuvimos una serie de situaciones con los registros, vamos a recuperar sus correos electrónicos y les enviaremos las ligas ya para que no tengan que volver a hacer un registro, sino que vayamos directo a la sesión del día 20 de marzo. Pues les agradezco mucho, que tengan un buen día.